My name is Thea Rivers. I'm 32 years old. I'm a captain in the United States Marine Corps. And at my own wedding, my mother slapped me hard enough to split my lip against my teeth. The chapel at Quantico went silent. 200 guests froze in their pews. I felt blood run warm down my chin and drip onto white lace, and my jaw rang like a struck bell. My mother stood there in a gray coat she hadn't been invited to wear, breathing hard, her hand still raised. Then my husband stepped between us. Daniel Brooks, Major Marine pilot, a man who has landed a KC-130 in a crosswind without raising his voice. He didn't raise it now. He said, calm as a checklist, "You just assaulted an officer. Face the wall." What happened in the next 90 seconds changed my mother's life. But here's what none of us knew standing in that chapel. The slap wasn't the crime. The slap was the cover story. And my sister had been building it for 8 years because my mother could not have walked onto that base alone. Someone signed her in. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where women who stayed calm tell you how they took their lives back. If you've ever been the family outcast and then found out who built the frame around you, this one's yours. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. Let me back up, because you need to know who was standing under that veil. I wasn't handed anything. At 16, I worked 2 jobs in Roanoke, Virginia, bagging groceries in the morning and bussing tables at night, saving for a college fund that never got past 4 digits. At 18, I stopped waiting for luck and walked into a Marine recruiting office. I enlisted in 2011. I spent years as a supply clerk, then a sergeant, learning that paperwork is just truth wearing a uniform. I finished my degree at night, one course at a time. And in 2019, I commissioned as an officer. They call us Mustangs, the ones who come up from the ranks. By 32, I was Captain Rivers' logistics officer, the person you call when 400 Marines need to be fed, fueled, and moved by Friday. Dry work, honest work. I met Dan at an airfield in North Carolina when his squadron's cargo manifest didn't match my paperwork, and he was wrong, and he admitted it, which is how I knew he was worth keeping. We rented a small apartment off base near Quantico, 10 minutes from the front gate. He flew. I planned. On Sundays, we made pancakes and didn't talk about work. It was the first quiet home I ever had. Here's the part people at the wedding thought they understood. I didn't invite my mother. Everyone assumed they knew why. A strange daughter, a bitter mom, old story, sad but simple. I assumed I knew why, too. I'd lived it, hadn't I? I had 8 years of one-sided silence to prove it. But the story I'd been living in had an author, and it wasn't me, and it wasn't my mother either. It would take a bloody wedding dress and a federal court date to make me finally check the byline. My family lived, and still lives, in a 2-story house on Fenwick Street in Roanoke, 3.5 hours southwest of Quantico if the traffic behaves. My father died of a heart attack in 2008 when I was 15. He was a quiet man who fixed lawnmowers in the garage and called me kiddo until the day he didn't wake up. After that, it was 3 of us. My mother, Carol, me, and my little sister, Lindsay, 3 years younger. The funny one, the one who could talk her way out of a speeding ticket and into a free dessert in the same afternoon. My mother worked the front desk at a dental office for 30 years. She kept that house scrubbed, kept the church potluck schedule taped to the fridge, kept her grief in labeled containers like everything else. Lindsay stayed. That's the geography you need to hold on to. Lindsay never really left Fenwick Street. She married at 20, moved 4 blocks over, divorced at 23, and moved back in with her son Caleb, who is 7 now, and thinks his Aunt Thea lives inside a phone screen. So the house held my mother, my sister, and my nephew. I held a duffel bag and a career 3.5 hours north. For 8 years, every piece of news I got about my mother came out of that house. Every piece of news my mother got about me went into it. I used to think of Fenwick Street as home base. It took me until this year to understand it had become something else, a checkpoint, with one person deciding what crossed in either direction. Every family has one story it tells about itself. Ours was that Mom and I broke each other's hearts, and neither of us would bend. That story was a lie. I just didn't know who wrote it. My mother's hand didn't come from nowhere. It came from her brother. Ray Calloway was 11 years her junior, a Marine, the kind of uncle who shows up in a loud truck and makes a 10-year-old feel 10 feet tall. When I was little, he taught me to stand with my shoulders back. "Rivers don't slouch," he'd say, which wasn't even his last name, and that was the joke. In 2004, when I was 11, 2 Marines in dress blues came to Fenwick Street. Ray had been killed in Fallujah. He was 29. My mother answered the door, and I watched her become a different woman between the porch and the kitchen. She never blamed Ray, she blamed the Corps. The uniform, the recruiters, the flag they folded into a triangle and handed her like it was supposed to balance the scales. Grief needs an address, and she gave it one. So, in 2011, when I came home and told her I had enlisted, she didn't cry. She went very still at the kitchen sink, and she said without turning around, "No daughter of mine wears that uniform." I was 18. I left 3 weeks later. She didn't come to my graduation from boot camp. She didn't come to my commissioning in 2019 when a colonel's wife pinned on my bars because my own mother wouldn't drive north. For years, I carried that sentence in my chest like shrapnel, and I let it explain everything that came after. Here's what I couldn't have known then, and what would knock the wind out of me 21 years after Fallujah. The man my mother mourned had left words behind words about that exact uniform, and my mother had never read them. Somebody in our house had made sure of it. But we'll get there. The slap comes first. Estranged is a strange word, because I never stopped paying rent on my side of the bridge. In 2017, when I made staff sergeant pay and my mother's hours at the dental office got cut, I set up an allotment. $800 a month, automatic out of my paycheck, into an account called Thea Rivers Care. Lindsay set the account up, and at the time, I thanked her for it. "Mom's too proud to take money from you directly," she told me on the phone. "This way, it's just there. She doesn't have to look you in the eye and admit she needs it." That sounded exactly like my mother, which is the thing about good lies. They're tailored. So the money flowed, $800 a month every month from 2017 on. I sent letters too, birthday cards, a note when I made Captain Short, just the facts, the way she liked things. Mother's Day flowers, ordered online, delivered to Fenwick Street. I never got a reply. Not once in 8 years. No thank you, no acknowledgement, not even anger, which at least would have been contact. I told myself it was pride. I told myself she cashed the checks and kept her silence because taking help from the daughter in uniform felt like surrender, and my mother did not surrender. On bad nights, Dan would find me at the kitchen table with my phone in my hand, her number on the screen, thumb hovering. "She knows the money's from you," he'd say. Money talks. Pride was one explanation for 8 years of silence. It was the wrong one. The truth was simpler and so much worse. You can't thank someone for water that never reaches your glass, and you can't answer letters you were never handed. My mother wasn't proud. My mother was thirsty in a house with a locked tap, and I was the reservoir wondering why she never wrote. I want to be honest about what I did and didn't do because I've heard the question in my own head 1,000 times. 8 years Thea and you never checked. I checked. In 2018, I called the house line on my mother's birthday. Lindsay answered on the second ring. She's asleep, Thea. She had a rough week. In 2019, after my commissioning, I called again. She saw the photo, Lindsay said. It upset her. The uniform. You know how she is. Every road to my mother ran through my sister's switchboard, and my sister was a gifted operator. She never slammed a door. She just held it almost shut forever and made me grateful for the crack. Twice a year, she'd feed me a scrap. Mom liked the flowers. Mom's knee is better. And I'd live on it for months. In 2021, I'd finally had enough of scraps. I bought a plane ticket to Roanoke. I planned to knock on Fenwick Street's door unannounced and sit in that kitchen until my mother said my name. 9 days before the flight, my unit got orders, a 9-month deployment. I moved the trip. Then the trip died, the way postponed things do. When I came back, Lindsay told me Mom had torn up the wedding announcement I'd mailed that one. It put me on the floor, the image of my mother ripping my name in half. Except, and hold this thought, the only witness to that torn card was Lindsay. The only witness to the anger was Lindsay. The only witness to all of it. Every cold shoulder, every rejected olive branch, 8 years of a mother's supposed contempt, was the one person living between us. A logistics officer audits every supply chain, except apparently the one that carries her own family. That's my competent failure, and I own it. I trusted a single source in my job. We call that a critical vulnerability. I trusted one in my life and called it estrangement. Dan proposed in March in our kitchen, holding a spatula because we are not dramatic people. We chose the chapel at Quantico for the wedding. Both our lives ran through that base, his squadron, my battalion, our friends. And the chapel sits on a hill with light that comes through the windows like it's been rationed out fair. 200 guests, half of them in uniform. An arch of swords on the steps, afterward, the whole tradition. Planning it felt like the one operation I'd ever run where nobody could get hurt. Then came the question Dan asked exactly once, gently, over coffee. Your mom. Are we inviting her? I looked at 8 years of silence, at the torn announcement I'd been told about, at the sentence she'd said to the kitchen window in 2011, and I said, you can't invite a wound. He nodded and never asked again, which is its own kind of love. But I'm my father's daughter too. So I did one thing quietly. I mailed her a card. Cream-colored my own handwriting, the date, the town, in one line. I'm getting married in June. I wanted you to hear it from me first. No invitation inside. I won't pretend there was, but a door left unlocked in case 20 years of winter ever broke. I mailed it in April to Fenwick Street. I never heard back. And by then, the silence was just weather, the climate I lived in. I checked the box in my head, told Dan it was done, and went back to seating charts. Remember that card? Cream envelope, blue ink, postmarked April. It matters, and not for any reason I could have guessed while I was licking the stamp. At the time, it was one more unanswered letter in a stack I didn't know existed, in a house I didn't know was curated, addressed to a mother who didn't know I still wrote. June came in, clean and hot. The morning of the wedding, I stood in the chapel annex while my maid of honor, gunnery sergeant Maria Voss, fought my veil like it was an enemy combatant. Maria and I had known each other since we were corporals. She'd flown in from Camp Pendleton and immediately taken command of everything within arm's reach. Guests were arriving. Through the window, I could see dress blues in summer dresses climbing the chapel steps. The base coordinator, a brisk civilian woman with a clipboard, ducked in to run the final manifest. Groom's side is checked in. Bride's family, 2 guests' visitor passes came through Tuesday. All set. I was half listening, a hairpin in my teeth. Then the sentence landed. Bride's family, 2 guests. I took the pin out of my mouth. I didn't register any family. My side of the aisle was Marines and 2 college friends, all badged or escorted, through my own list, which I'd gone over twice, because of course I had. I do manifest for a living. The coordinator frowned at her clipboard. It came through the group RSVP. Rivers Party of 2. Passes were approved Tuesday. Approved by whom? I wanted the whole chain of custody, and I wanted it right then. Requested by whom? But the organist started the processional, and Maria took my arm, and 200 people stood up, and somewhere a coordinator's radio crackled, and the question got swallowed by the music, the way small alarms always get swallowed by big days. I want you to sit with that beat of unease the way I had to. Walking down the aisle toward the best man I've ever known, smiling through it, telling myself it was a clerical echo. Some cousin of Dan's mislabeled. Rivers Party of 2. Somebody out there had claimed my family's seats. I was about to find out who they'd brought. We made it to the vows. Dan had just taken my hands, and the chaplain was saying the old words about better and worse when the double doors at the back of the chapel opened hard enough to bounce. My mother came up the center aisle in a gray coat, moving like a woman wading upstream, and the first thing I registered, before fear, before anything, was that she looked older than I'd let her be in my head, and thinner. 200 faces turned. The chaplain stopped. I remember thinking absurdly, she came, some 10-year-old, still living in my ribs, thinking she came to my wedding. Then I saw her face and knew better. She stopped a foot from me. Her eyes went over my dress, my hair the Marines, standing in the pews, and her voice came out low and shaking. You're marrying it. The thing that took Ray on his birthday weekend. You stand in their chapel. I said, Mom, and got no further. The slap came from her whole body. My head snapped sideways. My lip split against my teeth, and the sound of it went up into the rafters and hung there. Nobody breathed. I felt blood reach my chin, watched one drop land on the lace at my chest and bloom. My mother stood frozen, staring at her own hand like it belonged to a stranger. And then Dan was between us. Not fast, not violent, just present, the way a wall is present. And he said, calm as a pre-flight checklist. You just assaulted an officer. Face the wall. 2 Marines from the Provost Marshal's office were already moving up the aisle because on a base, security is never far from a big event. They took my mother by the elbows, professional, almost gentle, and walked her to the back wall, while one of them spoke into a radio. Federal property, federal rules. She didn't resist. Over her shoulder, as they led her out, she looked back at me. And here is the detail that would keep me up at night long after the sting faded. My mother didn't look triumphant. She looked fed, aimed. 20 years of grief doesn't buy a visitor pass. Someone signed her in. Here's what nobody tells you about being assaulted at your own wedding. The paperwork starts immediately. While Maria pressed a folded handkerchief to my lip in the annex, a PMO sergeant took my statement with the careful blankness of a man who has seen everything twice. Because the chapel sits on a federal installation, a slap there isn't a family squabble. It's simple assault under federal law, Title 18. My mother was issued a violation notice on the spot, a citation with a date to appear before a federal magistrate in Alexandria, and an immediate debarment order, meaning she was barred from setting foot on Quantico again. They didn't cuff her. They processed her, which is somehow colder. 40 minutes later, Dan and I stood back at the altar. We talked about it for exactly 1 minute in the annex forehead to forehead. She doesn't get to keep the day, I said, and he said, then let's go finish it. That was the whole debate. I got married with a swollen lip and blood spotted on my lace, and I'd do it again. Outside on the steps, 6 Marines raised their swords into an arch. The last one dropped his blade to bar our path, tapped me lightly, and grinned. Welcome to the Marine Corps, ma'am. Everyone laughed. I laughed. 14 years in, and the Corps welcomed me the same day my mother was escorted off its property. Life stacks its ironies like that without asking permission. It was Maria who brought me the detail that turned the day from wound to case file. She'd walked the citation paperwork out with the PMO sergeant, and she came back with her jaw set wrong. Thea, the visitor pass request and the person who signed as her escort and drove her home just now. She handed me the copy. Under sponsor in tidy print, it said L. Rivers. Our wedding night was a 2-laptop night. I'm aware of how that sounds. We sat on the hotel bed in our going-away clothes room service, untouched. And Dan said the thing that became our operating manual for the next 3 weeks. We can be angry tomorrow. Tonight, let's be exact. Exact meant timeline. My mother lives 3.5 hours from that base. She doesn't drive highways anymore. Lindsay had mentioned that once, years ago, one of her scraps. She had no invitation, no base access, no way through that gate without a sponsored visitor pass requested in advance and approved through the system. Somebody had done all of that on Tuesday, 4 days before the wedding. Somebody had put her in a car, driven 3.5 hours, and delivered her to a chapel door at the exact minute vows began. I called the coordinator, apologized for the hour, and asked for the RSVP trail. She was kind about it. Brides with bloody lips get some latitude. The group RSVP had come through the wedding's online portal in May +2 under bride's family from an email address I didn't recognize, riversfamily.rsvp at one of those free mail services. But the contact phone number listed for past pickup wasn't unfamiliar at all. I'd been dialing it since I was a teenager. The house line, Fenwick Street. Dan looked at the screen for a long moment, and I watched the pilot part of his brain do what it does. Cross-check, confirm, no assumptions. Could be your mom used the house phone, he said. Could be I said. Except mom can't work. The portal doesn't have that email and hasn't driven past the county line since 2019. He nodded slowly. Neither of us said the name. Saying it would make it real. And I'd been wrong about my family for 8 years. And I wanted one more night of being wrong. It took 2 phone calls the next morning to make it real. The first was to the coordinator, who confirmed the visitor pass request had been submitted with photos of 2 IDs, my mother's and my sister's. Lindsay had registered them both, though only my mother had come inside. The second call was to Dan's cousin Beth, who'd been seated in the back row by the doors. I asked her what she'd seen before the doors opened. Beth got quiet the way people do when they realize their small detail is a big one. There was a younger woman with her in the vestibule, she said. Dark blonde ponytail. She had her hands on your mom's shoulders like a coach. I figured they were nervous family. She was talking right into her ear, and I heard some of it because the door wasn't shut yet. I asked what she heard. She said the woman told my mother that the program had a toast in it, a toast to the Corps that raised her. She said they're toasting the Corps on Ray's birthday weekend, Mama. You're the only one who ever stood up for him. There was no such toast in my program. There was no toast to the Corps at all. We'd kept the ceremony short in the speeches for the reception. It was fiction written for an audience of one, loaded into a grieving woman like a round into a chamber. And then the shooter drove 3.5 hours to deliver her to the target. My mother didn't light the match. My sister built the bonfire stacked, it soaked it, and then walked our mother up to it with a lit torch and whispered, "Go on, he'd have wanted you to." And when it all went up, Lindsay was already gone from the vestibule, waiting in the parking lot engine, running the only calm person on the whole base. The question I couldn't answer yet was the shortest one. Why grief does strange math, but it doesn't explain logistics. I spent the first days of what should have been my honeymoon at our kitchen table with a legal pad doing something I should have done years earlier, An audit, not of money yet, of information. I wrote down every fact I believed about my mother from the last 8 years, and next to each one, its source. Mom was asleep when you called. Source, Lindsay. Mom saw your commissioning photo, and it upset her. Source, Lindsay. Mom's knee is better. Source, Lindsay. Mom liked the flowers. Source, Lindsay. Mom tore up your wedding announcement. Source, Lindsay. Sole witness, Lindsay. I went down the whole page, and then a second page, and the pen started to feel heavy. 8 years of a relationship, and every single data point had passed through one node. There wasn't one letter in my mother's handwriting. One voicemail. In her voice, one photo of her holding anything I'd sent. I had built my entire understanding of a living woman out of secondhand reports, the way you'd reconstruct a war, from one embedded journalist, never once wondering who was paying the journalist. And it ran the other way, too. That was the part that made me put the pen down. Everything my mother knew about me had gone through the same node. What version of Thea had been delivered to Fenwick Street for 8 years? Who had my mother been slapping in that chapel, me, or a character someone had written for her? A cold daughter who never called, never wrote, never sent a dime, and then threw a military wedding on Ray's birthday weekend with a toast to the Corps. I sat back and looked at my 2 pages of sourcing. In my work, if every report in the chain traces to a single uncorroborated source, you don't have intelligence. You have a story, and somebody had been paid to tell it. I called Lindsay on day 4. I needed to hear the performance now that I knew it was one. She answered crying, which she does beautifully, always has. Thea, oh my God, your face. Is your face okay? I have been sick about it. I brought her there to make peace, I swear. I thought if she just saw you happy, something would soften. I had no idea she'd. God, I can't even say it. I let the silence sit. She filled it. They always fill it. Listen about this court thing. Federal court Thea, she's 61. You have to tell them to drop it. She can't have a record. She can't do a courtroom. It would kill her. A pause, and then the tell, so smooth, I'd have missed it a month earlier. Just, whatever you do, don't call her. Don't write to her. She's fragile right now. Seeing your name would set her off. Let me handle Mom. I'll tell you when she's ready. There it was. The checkpoint, reasserting itself within 90 seconds, wrapped in concern like everything else she'd ever handed me. Even now, with blood barely dry on the lace, the first commandment stayed the same. All roads run through Lindsay. I looked at Dan across the table. He was listening on speaker arms, folded, wearing the expression he gets when an instrument reading doesn't match what the aircraft is doing. Okay, I said into the phone. You handle Mom. I could hear her exhale, hear the little smile arrive in her voice, victorious and warm. You're doing the right thing, Thea. Family first. Family first. I wrote the words on my legal pad and underlined them slowly while she said goodbye. Then I sat looking at the phone for a while. You handle Mom. Out loud, it was surrender. On paper, it was bait. If you've ever realized every bad thing your family believes about you passed through one person's mouth first, tell me in the comments. I read them. And if you're staying for the part where the paper trail talks, subscribe. Paper never yells. It doesn't have to. In logistics, we have a saying, trust, then verify the manifest. I'd done 8 years of trusting. Verification started with Ellen Marsh, Mrs. Marsh has lived across from Fenwick Street since before I was born. She taught half of Roanoke piano, and she forgets nothing. I called her from the car outside the commissary, my heart going like I was 18 again. She was delighted, then guarded, then once I asked my questions, plainly sad. "Honey," she said, "your mother thinks you hung the moon and then took it with you when you left. That's the story over here. Carol tells the church ladies. Her daughter never sent so much as a Christmas card." I asked as evenly as I could manage whether my mother seemed taken care of, whether money seemed tight. Mrs. Marsh made a sound I still think about. "Tight, sweetheart, last winter, Carol wore her coat indoors for a month because the furnace bill scared her. There was a week the power company put a notice on the door. Lindsay told everyone she took extra shifts to cover it. That girl tells everyone she's been carrying that house alone for years. $800 a month. 96 months. I did the arithmetic while Mrs. Marsh talked, and the number sat in my stomach like a swallowed stone. $76,800. Where does that kind of money go in a house where a furnace bill means wearing your coat at the kitchen table? I was forming the next question when my phone buzzed against my ear. Text message. "Lindsay." I pulled it back and read the screen, and the parking lot went a few degrees colder in June. "Mom's doing okay today. BT it to you. Don't bother Mrs. Marsh with family stuff. She's getting confused lately. Half of what she says is made up." I hadn't told a living soul I was calling Ellen Marsh. I looked up and down the row of parked cars, feeling watched in an empty lot. How did she know the answer turned out to be small town, simple? Mrs. Marsh had mentioned my call to another neighbor within the hour, and Roanoke's grapevine runs faster than fiber optic. But the effect on me was clarifying. Lindsay's instinct on hearing I'd spoken to a neighbor wasn't curiosity. It was suppression. Discredit the witness. Seal the perimeter. You only guard a border that hides something. So I stopped asking people and started asking records because records don't get nervous. The next morning, I sat down with my bank and pulled the full history of my allotment. Every transfer since 2017. It took 20 minutes and a large coffee. There they were stacked in neat rows like Marines at parade rest. $800 on the first of the month, every month, 96 transfers deep. Total, $76,800. Every one of them delivered, cleared, and swallowed by the same destination. Carol Rivers, Karen account at a community bank branch in Roanoke. Not one transfer had ever bounced or been returned. For 8 years, the pipeline had worked perfectly. Money went in, and by every visible measure, on Fenwick Street, coats indoors, in January. Shut-off notices on the door. A sister martyring herself in public for carrying the household nothing came out. From where I sat with my own statements, I could see the mouth of the river, but not where it emptied. My bank could confirm what left my account, but the care account belonged to somebody else's ledger, behind somebody else's privacy wall. Whose name was actually on it? What had 8 years of withdrawals looked like on the other end? The statements lived at a small brick bank branch in Roanoke, 3.5 hours south, in a town where my face still meant something, and my sister's ears were everywhere. Dan found me printing the transfer history at midnight. He read the total at the bottom. "When do we drive down?" We drove down on a Thursday. 3.5 hours of highway with a thermos and a plan, and parked 2 streets over from Fenwick, like a couple of amateur spies. The bank was stop 2. Stop 1 was Ellen Marsh, because I owed her a visit in person, and because she'd said something on the phone that had snagged in my mind like a burr. She fed us lemon bars and held my hand and looked at my healed lip without asking. Then she said, "Before you go doing whatever you're here to do, I have something that belongs to your family." Carol asked me to keep it, years ago now. When she cleared out the hall closet, she said she couldn't have it in the house, and she couldn't throw it away. And would I just hold it? She came back from her spare room with a cardboard box taped shut, soft at the corners from a decade of attic seasons, written on the side in my mother's careful hand, Ray. She never came back for it, Mrs. Marsh said. Never once asked about it. I think having it across the street was as close as she could stand. I sat with the box on my knees. My uncle had been dead for 21 years, and I'd carried him with me into every rank I'd ever pinned on. And here he was, 4 pounds of him in a neighbor's box across the street from the house where his sister had turned his death into a religion with the core as the devil. Dan put his hand flat on the lid, a pilot checking a panel. You don't have to open it today. I did have to, though. That's the thing about manifests. Once you know a container exists, you can't unknow it. And everything I believed about my family had already come out of one box I'd never checked. I opened it in the car, parked under a maple, 2 streets from the house neither of us could knock on. On top lay the flag folded into its triangle, the one they'd handed my mother on the porch in 2004. Beneath it, his medals in a shallow tin, a photo of Ray at 25 squinting into some desert sun, arm around a buddy, laughing at something forever. And under the photo, an envelope addressed to my mother in handwriting I hadn't seen since I was 11. Postmarked Fallujah, 2004. The seal had never been broken. Ray had mailed it 3 weeks before he was killed, and my mother had packed it away unread because reading it meant hearing his voice. And then she'd built 20 years of gospel on top of a letter she couldn't face. I opened it with Dan's pocket knife hands, not quite steady, and read my dead uncle's last words in a parked car, with my husband's hand on my shoulder. Most of it was ordinary and perfect. Complaints about sand, a joke about the chow hall, tell the girls I said hi. Then near the bottom, this. You know what I see out here, Carrie kids, who stood up when it counted. If a Rivers kid ever wears the uniform, tell them I said stand tall. It would be the proudest day of my life. I read it 3 times. I heard it in his voice by the second pass. My mother had slapped me in a chapel for wearing the uniform her brother had prayed one of us would wear, and she didn't know, because his blessing had been sitting in a taped box across the street for 2 decades, 40 feet from her kitchen window. I cried in that car, the only time in this whole story, and then I folded the letter along its old creases, the way you fold a flag, with respect for what it carried. When I finally looked up, Dan was staring into the open box. Thea, he said quietly, look at what's under the tin. Under the metal tin, rubber banded into a brick, sat a stack of envelopes. Cream white, 1 pale blue. Maybe 2 dozen of them. And I knew the handwriting on every single one because it was mine. My letters, my birthday cards, the note when I made captain, Mother's Day cards going back years, the cream envelope with blue ink, postmarked April 1 line inside, about hearing it from me first. All sealed. Not one had ever been opened. Someone had collected them from the Fenwick Street mailbox year after year before my mother's hands ever touched them and banded them together and needed them gone. And what better place than the one box in the world Carol Rivers would never open, in a house she'd never visit, guarded by her own grief. I sat there, holding 8 years of my own voice, every attempt I'd ever made physically intercepted, and I understood the architecture at last. My mother wasn't cruel. My mother was curated, everything and everything out-filtered by the same editor, until a mother and daughter 3.5 hours apart might as well have been on different planets, each believing the other had gone silent first. No daughter of mine wears that uniform. She'd said that once in 2011 in grief, and my sister had spent 8 years making sure it stayed the last true thing between us, replacing everything after it with fiction. And here's what chilled me more than anger. The mail. Whoever took those letters had done it steadily, patiently across years, which meant standing at that mailbox again and again sorting. deciding my name in her hand, walking it inside to a hiding place. Not an impulse, a procedure. Dan repacked the box like ordnance and started the engine. "Bank opens at 9 tomorrow," he said. "Tonight, we find a hotel." Neither of us said what we both knew. The mortar between every brick of this was Lindsay. Before the bank, I did what Marines do before contact. I got a map from someone who'd walked the ground. A few days later, back at Quantico, I sat down at the base legal assistance office with a patient Navy lawyer who let me lay the whole thing across her desk. Citation transfers, intercepted mail, the RSVP trail. She sorted it into lanes with a pencil, and I'll give you her map because it became mine. Lane 1, the assault. My mother's case would be heard by a federal magistrate in Alexandria. As the victim, I had the right to be heard, and my word carried weight. If I asked for context to be considered a first offense, a 61-year-old defendant, extraordinary manipulation behind the act, the court could resolve it with a deferred outcome. Conditions instead of a conviction. "Victims ask for hammers all the time," she said. "Courts notice when one asks for a scalpel." In Lane 2, the money. The care account was a state matter, potentially financial exploitation, and everything depended on documents from the Roanoke end. Who owned the account? Who had signing power? Lane 3, and she tapped the pencil twice, here. Any authority Lindsay held over my mother's affairs. If there's a power of attorney floating around, find it. Property records, too. When family money goes missing, the house is usually next. And all of that is public record at the county courthouse. I remember looking at her 3 lanes and feeling the ground steady under me for the first time since the chapel, because chaos had just become a mission with phases. She walked me to the door and said one more thing kindly that landed like a flare over dark water. "Ma'am, in these cases, the person controlling the information usually isn't done. You have less than 2 weeks until that hearing. I'd spend them quietly. Quietly I could do quietly. I'd had 8 years of practice. Lindsay called that Sunday right on schedule, warm as a heating pad. Mom was doing better. Mom had eaten. Mom, 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 the usual broadcast from the only correspondent allowed in the country. Then tucked between updates like a pickpocket's fingers, "Hey, did you talk to the court people yet? About dropping it?" "These things take time," I said. A small pause. And then my sister, who did not know what I had in a folder on the kitchen table, made her first unforced error. "Also, now that you're married and everything's changing anyway, the allotment, are you keeping that going? I just need to know for budgeting for Mom's care." For Mom's care. I looked across the table at the printout of 96 transfers, at the phrase Thea Rivers Care, sitting in the account column like a joke with no punchline, and I kept my voice level, which 14 years of briefing colonels will teach you. "I haven't decided," I said. "Should I keep it going?" And she said, quick, too quick. "Yes, I mean Mom depends on it." There it was. In 8 years, my sister had never once acknowledged that money existed. "Mom's too proud. We don't talk about it." That was the standing rule. Now with a federal hearing 18 days out and her mother facing a judge, her first substantive question was about the pipeline. She asked about the money before she asked about the court date. "Write that down." I did. That night, I started a new page on the legal pad, a timeline running backward from the hearing, and Dan leaned over my shoulder to read the header, then went to the closet and came back wearing the face he wears for weather briefs. His squadron had a 4-day mission starting Wednesday. "I'll be back Saturday," he said. "Don't take the hill without me." I promised. I almost kept it. The summons made it official. It arrived in our mailbox at Quantico on a Tuesday. Government envelope. My mother's name in a font that has ended better weeks than ours. United States of America versus Thea Rivers. Hearing before the federal magistrate, Alexandria, Virginia, 9 in the morning, 21 days after my wedding. I stood at the mailbox, reading it twice, and I felt the whole situation change shape in my hands. Up to that moment, I'd been investigating a betrayal. Now there was a clock on it. Because here is what that envelope actually meant. In 3 weeks, my 61-year-old mother, who wore her coat indoors to save on heat, who had been starved of every letter I ever wrote, and force-fed a fiction about a daughter who abandoned her, was going to stand in front of a federal judge for a crime she absolutely committed with her whole chest in front of 200 witnesses because my sister loaded her like a weapon and aimed her at my face. If I did nothing, the system would work exactly as designed. Simple assault federal property open and shut. A conviction, a record, maybe probation, a fine she couldn't pay. Boxed and shipped. And the one person who'd profit from that outcome would drive her home from the courthouse, pat her hand, and become the last relative she had left. My choices were just as clear. I could let the blind machine grind my mother, or I could walk into that courtroom and put the truth on the record myself, which meant that everything, the bank, the county records, the why of all of it, had to be in my hands before 9 a.m. on day 21. I pinned the summons to the corkboard over my desk dead center. 14 years of logistics comes down to one skill working backward from an immovable deadline. Fine, I'd planned harder movements with less time. Dan flew out Wednesday. Thursday before dawn, I drove south alone. 3.5 hours with a folder of my own bank records, riding shotgun like a partner. Our first pass at the Roanoke branch the Friday after the box had ended politely. At the privacy wall, the teller sympathetic but sealed. This time, I had an appointment with the branch manager, and I had standing. I wasn't asking to see somebody else's account. I was the originating sender of 96 transfers here to verify where my own money had been going. The manager, a tidy man with reading glasses on a chain, took my printout, typed for a while, and then did the thing people do when a screen surprises them. He took the glasses off. The receiving account, Thea Rivers Care. I can't share transactions, but I can tell you what's public-facing on the signature side since you're documenting a dispute. He turned a notepad toward me with 2 lines on it. Account holder, in sole signer, Lindsay M. Rivers. Authorized users none. My mother's name appeared in the account's title the way a ship's name appears on a hull. Decoration. Ownership nowhere. Thea Rivers had never been on the account at all. She couldn't have withdrawn $1 of my money if she'd known it existed. And she didn't know it existed because knowing was the one thing the sole signer could not afford. 8 years of my paychecks had gone home. They just never made it past my sister's hands. I thanked him, walked to my car, and sat in the lot with my hands at 10 and 2, going nowhere, letting it settle into place with a click I could almost hear. From this moment, I knew. And Lindsay didn't know I knew. Keep that in mind through everything that's coming. Every phone call from here on one of us was performing, and for the first time in 8 years, it wasn't her show. My phone buzzed against the console. Lindsay, you're in Roanoke. Somebody had seen my car. Somebody always sees your car. I let the message sit for 4 minutes long enough to be casual and typed back the first deliberate lie I have told my sister in my adult life. Visiting Dad's grave. Didn't want a whole thing. Heading back tonight. The 3 dots appeared, vanished, appeared. Then, oh, that's sweet. You okay? I said. I was fine, she said. And I want you to admire the craftsmanship here. Don't swing by the house, okay? Mom's having a bad week. Seeing you would set her back. Even now, even with me 2 miles away. Standing on ground, she controlled my sister's reflex was the same as it had been for 8 years. Manage the border. Keep the two of us apart at all costs, using each of us as the reason the other had to stay away. I typed, "Wouldn't dream of it." And if you think that lie cost me nothing, you've never sat in a parked car 2 miles from your mother, not allowed in, by order of the border guard, and put the truck in gear. Anyway, for the record, I did go to Dad's grave. I'm not built for wasted cover stories. I told the headstone more than I told anyone but Dan, and my father listened the way he always had, without interrupting. It was on the way out of the cemetery, stopped at the light on Route 11, that I saw it, a lawn sign 2 doors down from the corner. Red and white, foreclosure auction with a date. Not my mother's street, but close enough to Fenwick to make my hands tighten on the wheel, because a thought I hadn't let myself finish for a week finally finished itself. $76,000 hadn't kept that house warm. So what exactly was holding my mother's roof up? The courthouse could tell me. It was open till 4. The county records office smells like every archive on earth. Dust and toner and patience. I gave the clerk the Fenwick Street address, and 20 minutes later, I was at a corner table with a stack of certified copies, reading my family's private catastrophe in the most public place in town. Document 1, a general power of attorney, executed in 2023, granting Lindsay M. Rivers broad authority over the affairs of Carol Rivers. Notarized, stamped legal. I checked the date twice because I keep calendars in my head the way other people keep grudges. Spring of 2023 was my mother's cataract surgery. Lindsay had mentioned it in one of her scraps. Both eyes. Poor Mom. Signing everything large print for a while. Signing everything. Document 2, a deed of trust, recorded 8 months later. A loan against the Fenwick Street house, my mother's house paid off in full by my father's life insurance in 2009, free and clear, for 14 years. Newly in, $60,000, executed by Lindsay M. Rivers, as attorney in fact for Carol Rivers. My mother's roof pawned by proxy, and I would have bet the truck that she had no idea it had happened. Document 3, stapled to nothing, filed 6 weeks ago, a notice of default. 3 payments behind. The lender's next step, per the boilerplate, would be a foreclosure sale on the courthouse steps, the same steps I could see through the window, worn smooth by a century of other families' worst days. I sat back and lined it up. My sister hadn't just been draining the tank for 8 years. She'd borrowed against the hull. $76,000 of my money, $60,000 of the bank's, and underneath it all, a 61-year-old woman wearing her coat indoors, insulated from every fact by the same hands that were selling the floor out from under her. My sister hadn't stolen my money. She'd mortgaged my mother's roof. I drove home that night with certified copies on the passenger seat and one question left: the why. Because even a case you're winning needs a motive you can believe. It came together over the next few days from Mrs. Marsh, from public filings, from the kind of casual questions old classmates answer without knowing their depositions. Lindsay's divorce in 2019 left her with Caleb a car payment and credit cards her ex had maxed in both their names. In 2022, she'd opened a boutique downtown. Candle signs about wine o'clock, the whole aesthetic on borrowed money. It lasted 9 months. The lease broke her. So, there's your engine. A single mother, drowning quietly in a town where she'd promised everyone she was thriving, living rent-free in her mother's house, with her mother's mail in her hands, and her sister's $800 a month flowing into an account only she could touch. It would have started small. It always starts small. A borrowed 100. A covered card payment. Next month, I'll square it. Then the boutique died, and small became structural. By the time I mailed my wedding card, my money wasn't a theft she was hiding anymore. It was the load-bearing wall of her entire life. And the one thing that could bring it all down was the two of us, Mom and me, in the same room for one honest hour. I understand my sister. I want to be clear that understanding is not forgiveness. You can do the math on a landslide and still bury the village. Every choice stayed a choice. The mail, the whispers, the pawned house, the chapel. But when people ask me how a person does that to her own family, I give them the honest answer. Slowly. That's how. One reasonable-sounding decision at a time. We never talked, my mother and I, for 8 years. She couldn't afford it. Literally. Which brings us back to my wedding. Because once you hold the ledger, the chapel stops looking like a tragedy and starts looking like a transaction. Walk it through with me the way I walked it through for Dan. The night he got back, standing over the kitchen table, we'd turned into a war room. Problem from my sister's side of the board. The default notice had landed. Foreclosure was months away, maybe weeks. When it hit, secrets would start dying in bunches because you cannot hide an auction sign on your own lawn. Mom would learn about the loan, which meant learning about the power of attorney, which meant every thread led back to one signer. Unless the family blew apart first, so completely and so publicly that no one would ever again put Mom and me in one room to compare notes. Enter the wedding. She requests the visitor passes herself Tuesday. She loads the round a toast to the core that never existed on Ray's birthday weekend. She drives our mother 3.5 hours and walks her to the chapel doors at the precise minute maximum witnesses face forward. Best case for her, mom assaults a federal officer on a federal base, gets a record, and Thea, wounded on her wedding day, in front of 200 guests, never speaks to Mom again. The estrangement becomes permanent court certified. And a mother with a federal conviction and no other family leans all the way into the only child left, who now has a documented reason to say Mom isn't well. Let me handle everything. The slap was never rage. It was paperwork. A signature executed by my mother's hand, drafted by my sister, filed in front of 200 witnesses. My mother thought she was defending Ray. She was co-signing her own guardianship. Dan stared at the table for a long time. So, what do we do with it? What we did was build a package. And I want to show you the asymmetry on purpose, because it's the whole point of this story. My sister's arsenal: cataloged whispers, intercepted mail, borrowed grief, a crying voice for every occasion, and a talent for standing between two people who loved each other and translating them into enemies. Mine, a manila folder. Tab, 196 bank transfers. Originating account, mine. Receiving account, hers. A notarized summary on top. Tab 2, certified copies from the county. The power of attorney, the $60,000 deed of trust, the default notice. Tab 3, the visitor pass request, an RSVP. Trail from the wedding sponsor line, signed L. Rivers. Tab 4 in a plastic sleeve, because my hands didn't trust themselves, one unopened letter from Fallujah, 2004, and a brick of my own unopened mail. No recordings, no ambushes. No screaming phone calls she could quote later. Paper. Sworn, stamped, certified paper. You cannot cross-examine a deed. I called the victim witness coordinator for the magistrate's court and confirmed I'd be heard at the hearing. I briefed the legal assistance attorney, who read the folder in silence and then looked up and said, "You know, this clears your mother as much as it convicts your sister." And I said, "That's the mission." Then 8 days out, my phone lit up. Lindsay. I let it play. Hey, so logistics for court. I'm driving Mom up the night before. We'll stay at that motel by the courthouse. Listen, I really think you shouldn't come. Seeing you might push her over the edge. She could say something crazy in front of the judge. I'll represent the family. I'll tell you everything after. I sat with the phone against my ear, looking at tab 3. My sister was personally delivering our mother to the one room in Virginia where I had standing subpoena-grade paper in the floor. Okay, I said. Drive safe. 21 days, 96 bank transfers, 1 unread letter from a man who died believing in me. If you've ever had to choose between winning and being right about your own family, stay with me. The courtroom's next. And subscribe, because the ending isn't loud. It's worse. The night before the hearing, Dan and I did what we do best. We briefed it. Folder on the table, contingencies on index cards. If the magistrate declines context, hand the folder to the victim witness coordinator anyway. If Lindsay speaks first, change nothing. If Mom won't look at me speak to the bench, the record here is fine. Dan tapped the table edge instructor voice on. Fly the aircraft, not the emergency. Meaning, whatever explodes in that room, tears accusations, my sister's entire repertoire, I fly my own plan. Straight and level airspeed alive. We went through it twice. And then I told him the part I hadn't said out loud yet, because saying it made it a mission parameter. Tomorrow isn't about beating Lindsay. If I walk out of there with a convicted mother and a humiliated sister and nothing else we lost, the mission is Mom walks out with the truth and a way back, and Caleb doesn't get buried in the wreckage. Caleb, 7 years old, crazy about dinosaurs, guilty of nothing except being born into the blast radius. Whatever happened to his mother tomorrow? And things were going to happen to his mother? He still needed a grandmother with a roof, an aunt who showed up, and adults who did not audition him for sides. Dan nodded, slowly, moved 1 index card to the top of the stack, and wrote a single word on it. Caleb. We packed the folder. Last on top, I placed a cream envelope, blue ink, postmarked April 1 line, instinct about hearing it from me first. Still sealed, because some evidence isn't for the judge. Then I laid out my Service Alpha uniform on the chair, like armor ribbons squared with a ruler, and I slept better than I had any right to, the way you sleep when the plan is finally heavier than the fear. At 6 a.m., we drove north to Alexandria. Federal courthouses are built to make everyone feel small, which is fair because everyone in them is. We arrived at 8:15. I saw them at 8:40, coming through security at the far end of the marble hall. My mother gray coat, again thinner than the chapel 3 weeks ago, moving carefully, and my sister at her elbow, not supporting her, steering her. There's a difference, and once you see it, you can't stop seeing it. A hand that doesn't hold, but directs. A body angled to stay between its charge and every other person in the corridor. Border Patrol fully deployed. Lindsay was dressed like a family crisis. Cardigan, no makeup tissues at the ready, and she was scanning the hall. I watched the moment she found me. Me, in Service Alphas, standing beside a Marine major next to the victim witness coordinator, holding a manila folder. Her face did something complicated. The script said, I wasn't supposed to be here. She'd closed that door herself days ago. And I'd said, okay, people who run on scripts do not improvise well. Then my mother saw me across 40 feet of marble for the first time since her hand met my face. My mother's eyes found mine, and I watched them do what they'd done over her shoulder in the chapel. Search, flicker, almost open. And then Lindsay's hand tightened on her arm, and a murmured word went into her ear, and my mother turned her face away first. 3 weeks of certified paper in my hands, and that little half second still went through me like a bayonet. Dan's shoulder touched mine steady. The courtroom doors opened. A clerk leaned out with a list and called the morning docket, and my mother flinched at her own name in a stranger's mouth. United States versus Thea Rivers. We all went in together, one family single file through the same door. Magistrate courtrooms run on efficiency, not drama. The judge was a compact woman with reading glasses and a docket to burn, and my mother's case came up third. She stood at the defense table beside a duty attorney she'd met that morning, pleading hands folded, while the government's lawyer read the facts in the flat language of Title 18. On the date in question, at Marine Corps Base Quantico, the defendant did strike Captain Thea Rivers, United States Marine Corps. Simple assault, federal jurisdiction. My mother's shoulders came down half an inch at the word strike, as if hearing it officially made it heavier. The magistrate skimmed the file, then looked up over her glasses. I see the victim has asked to be heard. Is she present? I stood, and you have to understand what standing meant in that room, because until that second, my mother had never seen it. Not once in 14 years. She'd refused the boot camp graduation, the commissioning every photo. Whatever Lindsay had described to her, and now I knew better than to guess the woman in her head was a runaway daughter in a costume. What rose from the gallery instead was a Marine captain in Service Alpha's ribbons, squared shoulders, set the way her dead brother taught me at a kitchen table when I was 6. I heard my mother make a small sound. I watched my sister go pale in real-time, cardigan and all, because captains get listened to, and listened to was the one thing I could never be allowed to be. Your Honor, I said, Captain Thea Rivers. I'm the victim in this case, and I'm also the defendant's daughter. The magistrate nodded. Proceed, Captain. I stepped to the lectern and set down the folder. Ma'am, before this court decides anything about my mother, there are 96 documents I'd like to explain. They'll take 5 minutes. They change everything about this case. I kept my voice at briefing register, the tone you use when the facts are dramatic enough on their own. Your Honor, the assault happened. My mother struck me at my wedding in front of 200 guests. My lip needed 2 days to close. I'm not here to minimize it, and I'm not here for a hammer. I opened the folder. I'm here because the court is about to sentence the wrong version of this story, and I can prove it with bank records and county filings. The magistrate took her glasses off, which I'd learn is what that particular judge does, instead of leaning forward. Ma'am, my mother struck me once. Someone else has been striking her for 8 years on paper. I laid out the request first, so the court knew my destination. As the victim, I was asking for a deferred outcome, conditions, grief counseling, no conviction on completion, and I was asking the court to hear the context that made a 61-year-old dental office receptionist with no record cross the state to hit her own child. The duty attorney stood very still, aware something had shifted in his client's favor and not yet sure what. At the defense table, my mother stared at me with an expression I had no file for. And 2 rows back, my sister rose just barely into a crouch. Your Honor, may I? I'm the defendant's other daughter. I can speak to the family situation. The magistrate didn't look at her. You'll sit down. The captain has the lectern. Small moment. It won't make any transcript sound dramatic. But my sister had just been told by a federal officer in front of our mother to sit down, and something in the room's whole weather system began quietly to rotate. Tab 1, I said, and walked the clerk a copy. 96 bank transfers, $800 on the first of every month from my account beginning in 2017. Total $76,800 sent for my mother's support into an account titled Thea Rivers Care. I turned from the bench for the first time and looked at my mother and spoke the next part to her because it was hers. Mom, every month, the month you wore your coat inside, because of the furnace bill, the month the power company put a notice on the door, it was there. $800, The first of the month every month for 8 years. My mother was shaking her head, slow at first, then harder, and her voice came out cracked, half to me, half to the judge, the voice of a woman objecting to arithmetic itself. The money never came, Thea. Not one letter. And there it was, spoken into a federal microphone. The sentence my sister had spent 8 years building now, on the record, where it could finally be tested. There was never any money. There were never any letters. You left, and there was nothing. The courtroom didn't gasp. Real courtrooms don't. It went the other way, still everyone tracking the 2 sentences hanging in the air. The victim swears she sent it all. The defendant swears none of it arrived. Both women, everyone could see telling the truth. And when 2 true statements can't fit in the same house, the whole room starts looking for the missing wall between them. The room where sent becomes never arrived. I watched heads turn the prosecutor, the duty attorney, the clerk one by one, not toward me and not toward my mother, but toward the second row, toward a woman in a cardigan who had gone the color of courthouse marble and put a hand out for the bench in front of her. Tab 2, I said gently now, because the next 5 minutes were going to take my mother's history apart, and there is no gentle way, only a gentle voice. The account those 96 transfers went to, certified by the branch. Sole owner and sole signer, Lindsay M. Rivers. My mother's name is in the title. My mother has never had access. I laid it down. Tab 3 from the county recorder. A power of attorney signed spring 2023, while my mother was recovering from eye surgery and signing large print documents she trusted her caregiver to summarize. Tab 4, recorded 8 months later, a $60,000 loan against the Fenwick Street house executed under that power of attorney. The house is currently 3 payments behind. There's a default notice on file. Foreclosure is the next step. Paper travels a courtroom in silence, and silence has never been louder. Then I lifted the last thing in the folder, a brick of envelopes with a rubber band. And these are mine. 8 years of letters and cards I mailed to my mother at Fenwick Street. Birthday cards. A note when I made captain. All of them sealed. All of them intercepted from her mailbox before she saw them. They were hidden in a box across the street. I looked at her. It came Mom. Every month for 8 years. It just never got past your front door. My mother stood up without permission, and nobody stopped her. And she wasn't looking at me anymore. She was turning 1 slow degree at a time, the way people turn when they already know what's behind them, toward the second row, toward her younger daughter. And on Lindsay's face, my mother met the same answer I'd found at a bank window, in a records counter, the answer that had been living in her house, eating at her table, steering her by the elbow for 8 years. Lindsay, my mother said. Just the name. A question, a verdict, a funeral, all at once. The wall between the true sentences was standing in row 2, and it was starting to crack. People break along their manufacturing seams. My sister's seam was performance, so when she broke theatrical. She came up out of the second row with tears already running, hands out, voice pitched for the back of a theater. Okay? No, you don't get to do this. You left Thea. You left me with everything. The house, Mom, the bills, Caleb. My whole life went into that house while you played soldier and sent your little allowance and felt good about yourself. The marshal took 1 step. The magistrate said, "Ma'am, be seated." And my sister did the one thing you cannot do. She rolled through a federal judge like a stop sign in an empty lot. I kept it. Fine. I kept the money. I was owed that money. Do you know what my life is? In that house I've lived there. I take care of everything. That house is half mine anyway. Sworn confession unprompted on the record. The money, the entitlement, the loan. The duty attorney closed his eyes. The prosecutor was writing. My mother stood absolutely still in the middle of it, watching her younger daughter the way you watch weather take your barn. And me, I said nothing. I'd promised Dan fly the aircraft, and the aircraft was straight and level, and everyone else was in the storm. From the corner of my eye, I found him in the gallery, arms folded, and the old chapel sentence rewrote itself between us without a word passing. 3 weeks ago, someone calm had said, "Face the wall," and the wrong woman had been walked out of the room. The marshal reached the second row on the magistrate's nod. "Ma'am, seated or escorted? Choose." Lindsay sat chest-heaving mascara, filing its own report. And in the sudden quiet, the magistrate looked at her for a long cataloging moment, then turned back to me. "Anything further?" "Nothing further on the assault, Your Honor," I said, and closed the folder. "The rest belongs to other venues." I'd only asked the court to note what it just heard. Other venues. Here's what that meant and what the following weeks delivered, because I want you to see that nothing I did was rage. It was routing. The magistrate directed the courtroom deputy to preserve the record and referred the financial matters to the appropriate authorities in Roanoke, where Adult Protective Services and a Commonwealth's attorney take an interest when a caregiver with a power of attorney turns up as sole signer on a relative's support account in a fresh lien. The certified folder minus 1 cream envelope went with the referral. The community bank, on notice of a documented dispute, froze the care account by end of week. And the power of attorney, the master key to everything, died in a hallway that same afternoon when my mother, with legal aid summoned by the duty attorney, executed a revocation in triplicate. I watched her sign it against the marble wall, watched her press so hard the pen tore paper, the first decision she'd made, with full information in 8 years. No handcuffs that day. Real endings are quieter and heavier. An investigation opened. An account frozen with what remained of my $76,000. A revocation recorded. A foreclosure paused by the lender pending fraud review. And my sister's phone beginning to fill with calls from official numbers that do not go away when you cry at them. Lindsay stood in the corridor watching her infrastructure come apart, one document at a time, and the machine didn't hate her, and that was the worst of it for a performer. You can seduce a person. You can guilt a family. Paper doesn't blink. As for our mother, the court wasn't finished, and neither, God help me, was I. The magistrate accepted the disposition I'd asked for. Deferred outcome. 6 months of grief counseling with a program that works with Gold Star families. Stay out of trouble, and the record closes clean. The debarment from Quantico state actions keep some consequences as they should. "Mrs. Rivers," the magistrate said at the end, glasses back on, "your daughter came here in her country's uniform and spent her time protecting you. I suggest you spend the next 6 months figuring out how that happened." Adjourned. In the hallway with Dan, a discreet 10 feet away, I did the last thing in my plan. I handed my mother the envelope from Fallujah. "It was in the box you left with Mrs. Marsh," I said. "It's been sealed since 2004. You should have had it 20 years ago. And then you should have had 8 more years of mail, and you'll get that too. But this one first." She read her brother's last letter, standing against a marble wall, one hand pressed flat against the stone, like she needed proof the building was real. I watched her reach the bottom, watched her lips move on the words. "If a Rivers kid ever wears the uniform, tell them I said stand tall. It would be the proudest day of my life." My mother folded in half quietly, the way old trees go, and I caught her. And for the first time since 2011, my mother let me. There was no clean apology. Real ones take longer. What she said into my shoulder, broken open, was 20 years. "I slapped you for the uniform he was proud of." And I gave her back the only sentence that had survived our whole war, turned right side up at last. "Your daughter wears the uniform, Mom. She has for 14 years. He knew you'd need telling." We stood there in a federal hallway, a captain in service alphas, and a woman with a letter 21 years of grief changing hands, and the marble held us both up the way it's built to. I want to tell you what I didn't do next, because this is the part of the story that's actually mine. I didn't move my mother in with us. I didn't pay off the $60,000 loan with a dramatic check. I didn't dismantle Lindsay's life beyond what the paper had already set in motion. And I didn't stand between her and any of it either. Boundaries, it turns out, work in every direction. My mother did her own work, kept every counseling appointment, sat with legal aid through the restitution filings, learned her own bank passwords for the first time at 61, and started session by session to renovate 20 years of a grief that had been built on a lie about her brother. We met for coffee once a month, neutral ground a diner off Route 11, and we rebuilt the way you rebuild trust, which is to say, slowly and with receipts. Forgiveness is a door. It's not a doormat. With Lindsay, I drew one line, and I made it about the only innocent party left. Whatever the courts decided, Caleb would not be collateral. He would not be used as a shield in her negotiations. He would not be dangled or leveraged, and he would not lose his grandmother's house, his school, and his aunt. In the same season, his mother's story collapsed. I told her that in one short phone call, the last one for a long while, she started crying, angling for the old channels. I said, "This isn't a negotiation. It's a boundary." And I hung up. And you know what? It did get easier, exactly the way the counselor said it would. The mission was never to win the family. It was to stop losing it to a single point of failure. We walked out of the courthouse at 11:40 in the morning, 21 days after a slap that had been meant to end my family, and instead had X-rayed it. The sun off the marble steps was the flat white of Alexandria in July. Dan unlocked the truck, held my door, and said deadpan, "Nice landing, Captain," which in pilot is a love letter. I stood a second before getting in and looked back at the building, the flags at the entrance dead, still in the heat, and took inventory the way you do after contact. My lip healed. My mother, 61, walking to a legal aid office with her own paperwork in her own hands for the first time in years, terrified and free both at once. My sister somewhere behind us in that marble maze with a phone full of official voicemails, learning the difference between an audience and a witness. My nephew, 7 at school in Roanoke, still innocent of all of it with a dinosaur backpack, and though he didn't know it yet, an aunt who was done living at the far end of a filtered line. 96 transfers, a brick of intercepted mail, 1 letter from Fallujah, 1 gray coat, 1 white dress with a bloodstain the cleaner never fully defeated. And I kept the dress anyway because it's the truest thing I own. The slap took 1 second. The truth took 21 days. Fair trade. I got in the truck. Dan pulled us into traffic north toward Quantico, toward the base my mother can never enter, and the life she no longer needed to enter to be part of. And for 3.5 hours, neither of us turned on the radio because some quiet you earn, and it plays better than anything. 4 months out, here's the after-action report. All of it measurable, none of it a miracle. The Fenwick Street house is safe. The lender, faced with a fraud investigation, worked with legal aid on a supervised refinance, and the restitution plan pins Lindsay's repayments to it for the next decade. Lindsay took the deal her lawyer begged her to take. Full restitution schedule, a suspended sentence, supervised financial probation, and an apartment across town because living under our mother's roof was over. She has Caleb on a custody schedule, and to her small credit, she signs him over to Grandma's every week without theater. Maybe because the courts are watching. Maybe because some floor of her is still a mother. I've stopped needing to know which. Caleb spends his weekdays in the house. His grandmother nearly lost doing homework at the same kitchen table where Ray taught me to stand up straight. There's a savings account for his sports and his someday funded by me. In his name alone, 2 signers required, and neither of them is his mother, because love can hold a boundary and a college fund at the same time. Nobody badmouths his mom in front of him. That's the treaty, and it holds. My mother finished her counseling program in October, and the assault case closed the way the magistrate promised. No conviction, record clean. The box came home from Mrs. Marsh's spare room. The flag sits on the mantel now, next to Ray's letter, in a frame next to a new photo. My mother and me at the vow renewal Dan and I held in our backyard in September. 12 guests, 0 military police, her hand on my shoulder, both of us squinting into the sun, the way her brother used to. She wore blue. I wore my dress, bloodstained and all. You can't see it in the photo. We know it's there. That's family. Last month at the diner off Route 11, my mother stirred her coffee for a while and then asked me a question she'd never asked in 14 years. Tell me about the day they promoted you to captain. So I told her. The hanger, the oath Dan, pinning one bar while Maria pinned the other, the colonel mispronouncing Rivers of all things. She listened the whole way through, hands around her cup, eyes up the way Mrs. Marsh listens to piano students who are finally playing the piece and not the fear. When I finished, she nodded slowly and said, Ray would have hollered, embarrassed you in front of everybody, and then quietly trying it out like a first phrase in a new language. I would have liked to be there. That's all, no violins. But I drove home with the window down, thinking about how a single sentence planted early enough and guarded well enough nearly cost us everything. No daughter of mine, and how it took federal paper, a dead man's letter, and a blood-stained dress to dig it out. My mother wrote a new sentence. Now I intend to spend the next 20 years helping her say it. So let me hand you the one line I'd stitch inside every uniform and every wedding dress in America if they'd let me. Standing tall was never about the uniform. It's refusing to shrink to fit the story someone else wrote about you. That's my story. 1 slap, 96 transfers, 1 letter that waited 20 years to be read. If this reminded you to verify things yourself, even with family, especially with family, take that as your sign. Check the paperwork. Ask the question. Make the call. And if someone you love is being kept behind a gate of someone else's lies, share this video with them. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.